a secret process has evolved inside government. Every single thing pretty much that I've just described in the last 5 minutes was either deliberately closed by Boris or the system just closed it down and Boris didn't even know or didn't care.
Some people would say, well, you put Boris in, so you bear a fair share of the responsibility.
Today, nobody on earth can say, this is how many people came in last year, this is how many people left. All the numbers are complete bullshit, fake numbers, right? The single most striking thing, and I would challenge you as an MP to argue against me, is...
Hello and welcome to Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer at The Spectator. This week we are joined by a very special guest, Dominic Cummings.
Now, Dominic was my colleague at the Department for Education. I suppose in Philip Pullman-esque terms, he was my demon during that time. But he went on to become the devil in the eyes of many, as the campaign director of Vote Leave and as the principal advisor when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. Dominic is nothing if not controversial. For some people, and here I'll lay my cards on the table, he's original, brilliant, insightful and creative. For other people, like my old friend David Cameron, he's just a career psychopath. But you'll have the opportunity to hear from Dominic direct as he talks to Maddie and I in this two-part conversation. And in the first part, Dominic will take us into Whitehall, into what he calls the heart of darkness. And we'll discuss what went right and what went wrong under Boris Johnson's premiership. And in particular, we'll look at the vexed question of COVID, where both Dominic and I are in the dock.
I think it's fair to say that in numerous different ways, in numerous different departments, and in an increasingly palpable way to ordinary people, the country is in a mess. How did we get here, and is it fixable?
Wow, we're going with the big one right to kick off. I guess I think the big picture of it, from my perspective, is that you have what we're watching now is the same process that you see repeatedly historically. You have a set of institutions and ideas that grow up in a certain period. And what happens is that these institutions and ideas and the people who believe these ideas get pulled more and more out of reality as time passes. The difference between the ideas and the institutions on the one hand and reality on the other hand gets wider and wider and wider, and then eventually the system falls down into the gap between the two. So you see this happen every few decades in Europe. You can see it, say, in the mid-19th century, in 1848. You have the old order of 1815, the international order, the domestic order. In the 1840s, everyone can sort of feel that things are falling apart. They fall apart in 1848. Over the next decade, a completely new world emerges. And essentially the same thing, I think, is happening now. The ideas and institutions of the post-1945 world, whether it's the EU, the UN, all of these sorts of things, the institutions, NATO, the ideas, they're falling into the gap. And it's extremely hard for established elites to say to themselves, as this process is happening, everything we believe is turned out to be wrong. Our institutions are useless and they need to change, because you have a lot of power and a lot of money locked into keeping the old things on going, right? So that's why historically I think the process, it's never one of it's very rarely one of gradual change. Right? The English process is unusual, but even there, it's jagged. It's much more normal historically to see sort of periods of relative stability and then crisis and collapse. We're going through that sort of thing now. The old parties are knackered, the old Whitehall is knackered, the old media is knackered, the old universities are knackered. They're all knackered simultaneously, but of course there's huge power and money involved, and they can't turn around or they haven't been able to turn around and say, okay, let's face up to these problems and adjust and change how we're going. As you've seen in crisis after crisis in the last decade, it's just doubled down again and again on doing things in the old way. And if you don't like it, then you're fascist, you're extremist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're driving themselves into a kind of deeper and deeper systems crisis with each turn of this cog.
And what do you think are for British citizens, what are the most vivid, morbid symptoms of this failure? So what's most going wrong in the country at the moment?
Well, I think we're at the point now, right, where pretty much every major institution is either failing or it's under attack pathologically from Whitehall. So, we saw in COVID, right? The two big successes were doing vaccine research faster and doing rapid testing. Both of those things were immediately closed down. You have a war with Ukraine, but instead of actually fixing military procurement, you make procurement worse and worse and worse. And you now have all these people coming back from Ukraine saying, this is the truth about what's happening on the battlefield, and the MOD says, whatever you do, don't tell the senior officials and the senior MPs and senior ministers the truth, because we've got to have more bigger tanks and da-da-da. You have NHS obviously imploding, you have public order in crisis, you have no-go areas all over the country expanding, you have collapse of confidence in the police. And then you also have, sort of tragicomically, you have Whitehall, the Cabinet Office, and the MOD spending huge amounts of money and legal effort to wage lawfare against British Special Forces at the same time. So exactly the sort of completely pathological behaviour you would expect from a system that's on its last legs.
And do you think that there are people in Whitehall and in the mainstream political parties who appreciate this, even if they don't acknowledge it as fully as you'd like them to?
I think there's very few inside the parties. I don't know what your impression of this is, but my personal experience is that the conversations I have with people that are most realistic about this, ironically in some ways, are actually with kind of deep state officials. They're the most likely, first of all, they're the most exposed to the actual most pathological toxic behaviour and its consequences. They understand it best, whereas MPs and journalists really don't understand, obviously, a huge amount about how the system really works behind the scenes, right? So the most interesting conversations I have with people about this are either with total outsiders or with the most insidery of the insidery people in the Cabinet Office or whatnot who have lived it all and understand it with fingertip feeling. But the MPs seem to me almost completely clueless.
You mentioned the lawfare against British troops. In fact, your wife, Mary Wakefield, wrote a fantastic interview with a former SAS regimental commander, I think, for our magazine, which for me was kind of baffling and eye-opening.
Yeah.
Where is this coming from and who's leading the charge on it?
So as you say, that interview is great, and I would strongly recommend your listeners to look it up. If you just Google Mary Wakefield and George Sim and the SAS, you'll find it. But so that's an interesting case, right? Because George and the people he worked with in the SAS then were taking down the IRA in the 80s and early 90s. They were given medals for the operations. Mrs. Thatcher went and visited Hereford and said, brilliant job in extremely difficult circumstances, well done, you're all heroes. And the exact same people now in their 70s are being told, you're going to have to lawyer up and find money from somewhere because you may be facing murder charges. Where's the chain of command on that? Tom King is still sitting in some cottage in his 90s. No one's arresting Tom King, right?
That was the
Defence
minister
Secretary.
The Defence Secretary at the
ordered
time,
it.
right?
Yeah,
So these soldiers were the people who were ordered to go and do this by the Prime Minister, then given medals for their efforts in extremely difficult circumstances, and are now being told, get ready for murder trials. So there's a couple of different things. One is, almost the heart of darkness in the entire system is the legal section of the Cabinet Office. One of the things that Jeremy Haywood did, effectively from his point of view, was to grab control of large parts of the legal system by bringing it into the Cabinet Office, calling it it's a very complicated process, but essentially he got the Cabinet Secretary's control of this legal entity inside the Cabinet Office, which then spreads its tentacles throughout the whole system and to a large extent displaced the old power of the Attorney General and the Attorney General's office. The Cabinet Office legal team is massively Remain. Remember, they leaked against their own government during the Brexit negotiations 2019-2020, which the Cabinet Secretary apologised for and said was unprecedented in British history to have our own government lawyers leaking against our own government negotiating team. Massively pro-Remain, massively pro-ECHR. And for them, the ECHR is a religious principle. It's a commandment that supersedes everything else. So from their point of view, defending that is critical. You then have the NIO, which we also had to cut out large parts, Northern Ireland office, which we also had to cut large parts out of during the Brexit negotiations because they were on the side of the Irish government and Sinn Féin IRA, not the British government. And also you have long-standing elements inside the MOD, which have always hated special forces. Remember, immediately after World War II, the SAS was closed down and other similar entities were closed down and then had to be revived later to deal with various disasters going on. So there's long-standing hatred and opposition to the very concept of British Special Forces in much of Whitehall. And if you have a completely pathological system, and you have a system where the officials and the lawyers are actually in control, and the ministers are largely NPC characters, not actually in real power, then it just drives this kind of behaviour. Ministers sort of look around, sort of somewhat baffled, so often not very happy about it. But of course, they can't stop anything happening. They just told the cabinet secretary, says there's no alternative.
No. Is there an issue also in the military? I mean, you might expect Sir Rowley Walker to kind of barge in and speak to the Prime Minister and say, actually, it's not right that people with no military experience are passing judgment on high-stress situations when people have made a split-second choice with people who are trying to kill them. You know, you can't do this.
Yeah.
Leave my men alone. Like, it's causing a real recruitment crisis.
Yep.
It's something that's deeply troubling to many veterans, and members of my own family are up in arms about this.
The system doesn't care. That's the whole point, right? I mean, you're in an unprecedented situation now where they're sending over, in 2025, SAS people are sent off on classified missions in the Middle East to go and whack various terrorists or whatever, right? They're then being arrested as they get off the helicopter, off in Syria or wherever, by Plod and told, we're arresting you under murder charges.
Oh, my God.
Right? It's completely insane. But the history of the last 10, 20 years is senior people in the British Armed Forces have had an extreme lack of moral courage in dealing with this problem. So in the last few weeks, you've started to have retired people speaking out. OK, good. But where were the retired people? The retired people know everything I'm saying is true. They were in charge of it. What did they do when they were actually in charge themselves? They said, oh, well, it's very political, and the cabinet secretary says there's nothing that could be done, and the ECHR is a political issue, so we've just got to swallow it. So, yeah, Rowley Walker should put his medals on, and Rowley knows what absolute bullshit the whole thing is, and he should go into number 10 and say to the PM, we're not having this anymore, and there's going to be mass resignations unless you actually commit to it. But, of course, it's politically now incendiary, because the thing which is driving it legally is the Human Rights Act. So the only way, I went into all this in great detail in 2020, the only way you can stop a lot of these things, similar to the boats, is by facing legal reality and saying, you either have to amend/repeal the Human Rights Act, or you have to put up with it. But you have to make a choice. Sunak wouldn't make a choice on the boats. The lawfare that's going on now is a similar problem.
Is there a case for saying that sometimes some of the virtues that you might associate with the British system are now being used against British institutions? So naturally, the army would say, we're generals, we're not politicians, the politicians take the ultimate decisions. Similarly, there is an instinctive belief in Britain that we are a rules-bound country, we operate with a system of liberty under the law, and therefore there's a natural deference towards those who are legal authorities. And also, we have confidence, ultimately, that if a scandal is big enough, that it will be raised in Parliament and ventilated by the press. And in a way, the point you're making is that all of those things are arguably, in a functioning society, civilised restraints on raw power, but we don't have a functioning society, and those restraints are now out of place.
Yeah, so I think your description of the British system worked like pre-1970s, right? But a couple of massive things happened. You have, first of all, membership of the EEC and the growth of European, well, EEC law as it was, and then EU law. You then have the Human Rights Act. You now have the Equalities Act, which is somewhat similar, but let's leave that aside for the moment. But in parallel to the EU and the ECHR/Human Rights Act, you also have this huge development of how judicial review works in the country. And these processes are completely entangled. So you can't separate out the effects of the Human Rights Act from judicial review. So then, as you know, Michael, when you're sitting inside government, not 1%, not 1 in 1,000 of the things that the Human Rights Act actually touches ever becomes public. But every day, as a minister, or every day in number 10, you're told constantly, oh, you can't do that because of the Human Rights Act. You can't do that because legal advice says blah. You can't do. Yeah. These things are never made public.
No, I mean,
it's a completely internal process. So I think what we've got is we've got an old British Whitehall and MP system, kind of this, evolved over centuries, right?
Yeah.
Then you've got now sitting on top of that, the EU system the Human Rights Act system and the judicial review system, combined with this, with the lawyers inside Whitehall, means that the old British system doesn't work anymore.
No, and one of the striking things, it's only a small footnote, is that when I was in the Levelling Up in the Housing Department, there were things that we wanted to do on building safety to help people post-Grenfell, to deal with the problems of leasehold, and we were thwarted because of the Human Rights Act. So there were people trapped in unsafe buildings, and there were people who had bought leasehold flats who were being ripped off, and government lawyers would say the A1P1, Article 1, Part 1 rights of the rich trump the interests of these folk, and it was the Human Rights Act that was, and the ECHR, that was the effective blocker. And I don't think there'd be a single person outside who would think that it was justified in that way, but it's how the system thinks.
Totally. Well, you and I remember, you'll remember, right, one of the first things that happened when we went to the Department for Education, we said we're going to change some of the legal guidance to strengthen the power of teachers and head teachers to search pupils for weapons, porn, dangerous materials of various kinds.
Basic discipline.
Immediately, the officials said, oh, you can't do that because legal advice says it's unlawful because of the European Convention of Human Rights, the right to privacy of the child. We had to go and get a top-notch barrister, pay him with taxpayers' money, and spend, say, 3-4 months or something arguing about that. All of that's completely invisible. No one outside the system has any concept that these things happen, right? But you multiply that, like that's something that we chose to make a priority, right?
Yes.
You say, we're not going to put up with it. We're going to hire the lawyer. We're going to have the battle. But as you know, these things just fire in at you often many times per day. And you can't do the same thing that we did, taking 4 months on each of these things multiple
and perhaps we don't
times
also
a day.
understand what the counterfactual looks like. You know, the opportunity costs, the time that was spent rummaging around to just do basic stuff.
Yeah, and the other thing is, you get a reputation in the department, in Whitehall more broadly. If you are dealing with every single one of these things, then you become a troublemaker. So the noise that's generated, the potential controversy that follows. So, and this sounds like an excuse for not doing everything that I should have done, but you have to pick your fights. Because if you're fighting on every front, you eventually become a virus that the system develops antibodies to. You become a problem that it needs to expel.
Sometimes viruses can win, though.
I'll leave that to others to judge.
The thing metastasizes, right, in such ways that it's extremely hard for outsiders to deal with. So when I said, through 4 years ago now, I think, people don't realise, but the madness of the Human Rights Act now means that a secret process has evolved inside the government that looks at various terrorist threats. And a very weird, perverse outcome of this is that the lawyers have decided that it's okay to send some special forces guy over to the middle of nowhere, watch someone come out of a building and drone strike them and kill them. That's lawful. But it's unlawful to have the same team of people grab him, put him in a helicopter, bring him back to Britain for questioning, right? All these human rights lawyers all over Twitter go, Cummings is insane, clearly completely bullshit, this madness is impossible, da, 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 da. Then, of course, over the next couple of years, more and more people come out saying, yeah, this is exactly what happens. So all these people, right, KCs, judges who are part of the system, also have no real understanding of the insane ways in which the bureaucracies morph behind the scenes in secret to cope with this public thing of the Human Rights Act. The system kind of reverberates internally because of legal advice and forces people internally to do all of these things, which are then kept completely secret. Now, the contrast, of course, is look at what's happened in Europe this year on very interesting aspects of how the Commission has suddenly behaved. The Commission, for the first time really, has started to get panicky on the whole thing about the boats in the Mediterranean and the effects on public opinion in the south. So very quietly behind the scenes, the Commission has just suddenly said to the Greek government and to the Spanish government, if you need to do A, B, C, just do it and forget the Human Rights Act and forget the ECHR. We'll turn a blind eye, we don't give a shit. Just solve the problem. Now that also is a very important dynamic, right, which shows the problem that Britain has. In Europe, it's a completely normal thing just to go, oh yeah, well, we signed up to all this shit, but actually now it causes this insane problem, so just deal with the insane problem and we don't care what the lawyers say.
Yeah.
Everything is normal. But in Britain, That's impossible. The Cabinet Secretary marches in and says, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but there'll be a judicial review and you'll be told that you'll be in contempt of court and potentially thrown in jail. So therefore, you must do the following thing.
Yeah,
and as you know, Michael, PM after PM has had exactly that conversation.
Totally.
Is there an element where leaving the EU may have actually made things worse for us? Because I think some of the Europhiles in Britain don't follow events, actually follow what's going on in Europe closely. They're still wedded to this kind of fantasy idea of what the EU was like maybe 10 years ago. So,
I mean, it's definitely the case that obviously a lot of the Romaniacs have been extremely radicalised by the process of leaving. And in lots of ways, the EU was much less polarised before, opinions were much less intensely held. And lots of the left actually had a lot of criticisms about the EU. That's all gone now, right? Because the EU is a complete cult for a large section of the old system, where you can't rationally discuss its problems. There is no analysis of it. No one cares about any of these things. So you're definitely right. A lot of the problems going on inside the EU now, they're not reported in the British media.
I think it's always been the case that in the UK, reporting or analysis of what happens at an EU level, and also a proper understanding of politics within those countries, has been deficient, because it was the case in the past, and it is even more the case now, that the effort to understand what drives the EU is one that, again, doesn't seem to sort of fit naturally into our political or media culture. The fact that you've got this political institution, which is not like sort of NATO, we might touch on defence in a moment, which is there in order to serve a single purpose. It's there to transform how those countries are governed internally and transform the shape of Europe to move towards a particular integrationist goal. But anyway, enough of me. One thing, Dom, that I want to touch on is the past before we go and have a look at the future, because some people will say, OK, fair enough, powerful analysis, worrying in its detail, but 6 years ago, you were the architect of an election victory. You had an 80-seat majority and 5 clear years ahead of you to fix this, and it didn't happen. Why not?
In 2020, we began to change almost all of the big things we started to change. So whether it was procurement, ironically, the meetings which I started immediately after the election on procurement in January 2020 that had to be cancelled in February 2020 to deal with total shit show over procurement with COVID. So procurement we started, planning law we started, huge change to how science and technology operate in Whitehall, the whole R&D ecosystem, the economic model, tax, the MOD. We began a whole process to uncover what are all the things that are rotten inside the MOD, why are they rotten. We got the MOD secretly to admit to dozens of things that were completely broken. Parenthetically, one of them was Ajax, which is now in the news in the last week, with the poor minister, classic modern Westminster, right? The poor minister going, well, I was told just a few weeks ago that Ajax was fine and don't know why it's in the newspapers that the soldiers are coming out rattled and deaf and throwing up. We were told in the cabinet room in summer 2020, Ajax is a multi-billion-pound total and utter shit show fiasco.
Armoured tanks.
Yeah, armoured tanks, exactly. Sorry. So we were told about this, but okay, that's I don't know what it is, 5-10 billion quid total disaster. It's been a disaster for many years. We were told that it was knackered. There were dozens of things like that. We were told in 2020 these things are all broken. We do a deal with the MOD. You admit all these things are broken. We shut down all the broken things. We save tens and tens and tens of billions. We shift the money to new things. We, for the first time in 20 years, have agreed budgets that the Cabinet Office, Treasury, MOD all agree that the numbers are true, not fake. Whitehall reform, as you know, we had the Cabinet Secretary agree in summer 2020 to profound changes to how hiring would work. As you also know, Michael, in summer 2020, the system essentially surrendered. So the normal story is vote leave was a total war with Whitehall over everything, including over civil service reform. Not true. many excellent officials agreed with the vote leave analysis on civil service reform. And after the whole system imploded in spring 2020, the senior civil service surrendered and said, OK, everyone here has watched the whole old system collapse. You, Dominic, have talked a whole load of stuff about this for 10 years plus. Obviously, you've got an 80-seat majority. The whole country needs rebuilding. It's now all going to happen. Surrender. OK. And you were in some of the meetings where we discussed the surrender terms with Simon Case, right? And how we were going to move forward. So on all of these big things, economy, science, Whitehall, MOD, the deep state, all of these things, we began a process, also, on borders, said, we're going to have an Australian point system, we're going to cut immigration, and we actually started building the infrastructure for the first time to start counting people in and out. Instead of having all of these fake numbers, which Britain, the whole British immigration debate, right, today, nobody on earth can say, this is how many people came in last year, this is how many people left. They can't do it. All the numbers are complete bullshit, fake numbers, right? We began in January 2020 a process to build the system needed so you could actually just know these people come in, these people leave, we keep tabs on them. Shouldn't be rocket science, but it was in Britain.
There were a couple of very good civil servants, I won't name them, who were actually genuinely excited
Don't ruin
about
their
it.
lives, Michael.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every single thing pretty much that I've just described in the last 5 minutes was either deliberately closed by Boris or, more often, the system just closed it down and Boris didn't even know or didn't care. So on all of these things, that literally take the counting in and counting out, right? If that system had been built, the whole discussion now about immigration would be completely transformed. But they literally closed it. So, and as you know, Michael, right, politically, when Boris said in 2021, instead of carrying on and delivering the 2019 manifesto and actually delivering the change that people voted for in 2016 and 2019, no, we're going to make friends with the old system again and really not do very much. All of the big things that were started to change in 2020 will bin it all. Most of the Conservative Party was very happy with that. Most of the Telegraph was very happy with that. Let Boris be Boris, right? Everyone went along with it. When Boris put up taxes in 2021, completely contrary to the guarantee made, him and Sunak did it. Tory party voted through, very little debate, even though it was a strategic disaster, politically completely stupid. Of course, it was praised by all the sensible pundits as a political masterstroke, as usual, of course. So in 2020, we began to deliver what the country wanted, right? And if you went through all of these things that I've just described and what we started doing in 2020, you now watch all over Westminster people going, oh, we need to do this on procurement. Oh, we need to do this with the MOD. We started it all. But the Conservative Party in Whitehall closed it all down.
Some people would say, well, you put Boris in. So you, and those of us who voted for him, bear a fair share of the responsibility.
So, A, I did not put Boris in. I very deliberately had nothing to do with the Conservative Party leadership contest or anything to do with the Conservative Party at the beginning of 2019. But it is true that after he won, he then came to me and others in the Vote Leave team and said, no one can see a way through this. Will you come to number 10 and try and find some path through this nightmare crisis? So yes, I thought we should try and do that. I thought that the prospect of watching Westminster cancel the referendum would have been catastrophic. And the kind of combination of cancelling the referendum with Corbyn waiting in the wings, I think, was a sort of double catastrophe. So yes, we did go in, we did bulldoze it through in 2019, but I think that was good in the circumstances, right? You can't, in politics, you don't have very much freedom. You have limited freedom to decide, are you going to try and do certain things in a context which you mostly have no control over. You are battered around by Tolstoy's great forces of war and peace, right? And your chances to make an impact are relatively minor. We chose in 2019 and said, OK, we're going to try and get Brexit done, force through an election, get a democratic mandate for change, and then deliver it in government. Will Boris blow up and screw it all up? There's a very reasonable chance that he will. But what's the alternative? The alternative is we all just sit at home and watch the system completely melt down.
But isn't there a risk overall that the expectations that you've set of politics and politicians are too high? So in the paper that you wrote after you left the Department for Education, after you'd worked there, you outlined an ideal of Odyssean education, which is a view of all of the skills that politicians need, which is demanding. You've written about the truly impressive politicians of history, whether that's Pitt or Bismarck. And the plans that you've outlined, and in some cases sought to implement for change, I think many people would find persuasive and compelling. But in our political system, you're dealing with flawed human beings. And that's not just because of politics, that's just because of human nature. What would you say to a critic or even a friend who would say, look, a lot of your diagnosis of what's wrong is persuasive, but given that you've got, clowns to the left and clowns to the right, as it were, then it's always going to be difficult to achieve what you want.
You have to separate out very carefully two different things, right? Perfection is obviously impossible, completely impossible, and history shows the recurring patterns. You read them in Thucydides and classical Athens, you see them today. There is no system which can eradicate some of these core problems of human nature unless human nature itself is re-engineered. But lots of the things I'm talking about are things that we know that imperfect humans with imperfect institutions can do. We can all look back and see how Whitehall and Pitt dealt with procurement and R&D and military procurement in the 1790s and 1800s. Whitehall in 1795, 1800 was closer to SpaceX 2025 in culture than Whitehall 2025 is to SpaceX 2025.
But Pitt and Elon are exceptional individuals.
No. Well, true. Pitt was an exceptional individual, but Pitt was also a product of a system. And there were many exceptional individuals around. And I think this is the other part of this, right? So we know that Whitehall could do a lot of these things much better because it did it. We know that the American system could do far better because you can just go back and read General Groves on Now It Can Be Told. You can read Freedom's Forge on industrial production in World War II. That's not a pipe dream. That's not, oh, this is impossible. Human institutions before the internet, before computers, could do all of this stuff, right? We know it's possible. But you are pointing to, I think, what is a profound change, and this is critical. If you look, what's the big difference between the Westminster of Whitehall of 1800 and now? It's the talent. In 1800, a large element of the most elite talent in the country was in some combination of Parliament, Whitehall, armed forces, intelligence services, deep statey type stuff, right? What is the big cultural change that's happened in the last few decades? It's the flight of elite talent out of public service in Western countries. And the collapse of the institutions is partly because of institutional dynamics, bureaucratic dynamics that kind of operate regardless of the electron people inside, but also because all of these, across the Western world, we've had this cultural shift of elite talent out to do other things. So General Groves now, where's General Groves now? He's working for Elon on rockets, or he's working for Patrick Collison in Stripe, or whatever it is, right? They're not sitting in the Pentagon program doing the F-35. And that is a huge problem. And you are right to point to that. And it's also correct to say, you can't expect institutions like Skunk Works or SpaceX if you don't have great people inside. It doesn't matter how you write down the organizational chart, it doesn't matter what legislation you draw or anything else. These things are always a mix of institutional structure and incentives on the one hand, and then elite talent on the other hand. So we've driven out elite talent. We can't expect Whitehall and Westminster to change without that. But that's why, going back to our conversations in summer 2020, we talked about, here's how various institutional structures need to change in number 10, the Cabinet Office and whatnot, right? All these boring things that you were very unusual as an MP in actually being interested in. Most of them aren't interested in. But we also talked to the Cabinet Secretary about how do we change the rules so we can hire in these people? Instead of Whitehall being closed by default and 99.99% jobs just being all internally promoted from the caste, the approved caste that controls the system, like a Hindu caste. Instead, you have to open it up and make the system open by default so that you can hire who you want. And then make ministers actually responsible. This is the last thing I'll say, then I'll shut up. You go back to the world of Pitt, you go back to the world of Palmerston, and then you look at today. The single most striking thing I would suggest, and I would challenge you as an MP to argue against me, is for them, responsibility to Parliament was real. It was not fake. Pitt & Co. had real investigations into procurement scandals. They destroyed careers. They threw people in jail. Palmerston didn't turn round when something went wrong and went, oh, well, I'll have to ask the Perm Sec and don't blame me, right? Palmerston said in a great letter to Queen Victoria, England will never have the European system of a permanent bureaucracy, and if it does, it'll be a disaster. What's the big shift that's happened? This shift in Whitehall is inseparable from the shift from ministerial responsibility to Parliament being genuine to ministerial responsibility to Parliament becoming a complete fake and a fraud. And you know, nobody actually believes in it, right? You go into Parliament and you stand up and you say, oh, yes, this disaster that's all over the Today programme, and then use this morning, I take full responsibility and blah, blah, blah. But it's not in your heart, you know, you don't take full responsibility for it. You didn't even probably know about it until last night when someone says, oh, my God, the front page of the Times tomorrow has this bloody nightmare story. Why is that? And then you read the papers, you talk to the Perm Sec, oh, my God, it's so insane. If I told the truth, no one would ever believe it, right? But you have to stand up and say, I take full responsibility, blah, blah, blah. But it's all fake. Now, the odd thing is, the country knows it's all fake. The voters know it's all fake. The only place where anyone still pretends that the fake is real is inside Westminster itself.
As you've said in the past, pro wrestling is more real than Westminster.
Rick Rubin, yeah. So the great Rick Rubin, head of Def Jam Records, has a great line. The news is fake, wrestling is real. And I think that is completely true. If you Google the Rick Rubin interview that he talks about it, and then think about the news now, you'll get the point.
Does this ring true to you, Maddie?
Well, yeah, I mean, in my sort of main job at The Spectator, which is being the parliamentary sketch writer, we're there to satirise and observe. I'm often just amazed by the enormous, great fissure in what's being talked about in Parliament versus what people are talking about in day-to-day life, and also the big stories that don't really get coverage at all. Just in the last week, there have been various scandals involving young Afghan men, either raping young girls in Britain, and these stories are either not being reported in a major way in, say, the BBC, or else the way they have been reported is in such a kind of psychopathic way. For example, 2 17-year-old Afghans are described as boys, but the 15-year-old girl that they raped is described as a woman. It's this kind of thing where there are times where I feel a bit like I'm going mad, like if you tried to just
and it's
describe
boys from Leamington or something, right?
Yeah.
And then it's only after the media actually sues and goes to court that their identities are revealed, and the boys from Leamington are revealed to be 2 illegal Afghan asylum seekers who just got off a boat.
It feels quite out of character for a place like Leamington.
No, we better get used to it in Leamington because there's going to be a lot more of it.
Oh, I know. And there's something very eerie about when it happens in places that were previously sleepy, leafy sorts of places. Very interested in what you're saying about Pitt and the way that he managed things, being closer to Elon Musk. I sometimes feel like C.S. Lewis described an idea called chronological snobbery, where there's a preference towards things that are newer just because they are newer. And I wonder if that is quite a feature of progressive thinking, particularly within the institutions. Like, why would we bother looking at that? It was so long ago, let's not bother.
I think there definitely is that feeling. It's also so often humiliating to look back at the past, so they don't want to. It's very humiliating for them to look back and go, oh yeah, actually they did all this much with far fewer people, like 20 times faster, without any of our modern technology. It's quite humiliating. So they have to write that off and say, oh, we couldn't possibly learn anything from that. It's exactly the same as what Michael and I witnessed repeatedly during COVID, of officials saying, oh, there's nothing to learn from Asia. No, it's pointless sending anyone over to Asia. When I arranged a task force to go over to Singapore and whatnot to see how Singapore had organised a lot of this, because, of course, Singapore had watched previous outbreaks of various diseases in China and actually got prepared for it, Whitehall was enraged, we don't want to go to that, and then it ended up actually scuppering the whole thing and never sending anyone. So there is this incredible, ironically, given that they're so Remain, and they're constantly saying that the Brexit people are parochial, there's an incredible parochialism inside Whitehall where they hate the idea of learning. I mean, remember when we talked to officials in the DfE about trying to learn from Germany and Switzerland and other places on things like apprenticeships and how they do vocational training and various manufacturing things and whatnot. Oh, the disgust faces were very apparent.
Westminster's favourite way of learning lessons seems to be a big inquiry.
That's pay a load of lawyers to lie. That's their favourite way.
Give them a knighthood, Yeah.
One thing, I don't want to sort of relitigate the whole of COVID, but one thing that Maddie's taxed me with is lockdowns were, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but in broad terms, initially you could sort of understand it, even though it was a bit of a mess. But overall, the whole approach to lockdown was unnecessary and overdone and offensive to liberty. Looking back, just put the whole inquiry to one side, because as we know, it's a legal circus.
Yeah.
And without necessarily attributing blame to individuals, but overall, as you look back at that period and what was necessary to deal with the pandemic, are there areas where you think critics of your approach have a point? Is there anything that the critics of your approach need to bear in mind?
Super complicated, but to simplify it enormously, I would put it like this. The first thing is you've got to separate out the period February-March from what happened in the autumn, winter, and in 2021.
Yeah.
Right? In my opinion, it's unarguable that there never needed to be any lockdown or anything approaching a lockdown in quarter 3, quarter 4, 2020, or in 2021. After the initial disaster, if the system had got its act together properly in summer 2020, if, for example, the Department of Health hadn't completely buried and lied about rapid testing, you'd have had a huge rapid testing build up over the summer, and you'd have had absolutely no need for any lockdowns later in 2020. I think that's unarguable. It's also noticeable, by the way, the inquiry is completely botched its reporting over the whole thing about it. Either it's confused or it's completely lying, who knows which, because it's so bad. So I think, for sure, all the later lockdowns were unnecessary and happened only because the pathological system itself just kept collapsing and couldn't find its way out of that. The first one, I think, though, is very different. I think the first one, if you have the complete benefit of hindsight, I think my conclusion would be, if you'd actually had proper pandemic planning and preparation in the first place, if we'd had the world's best pandemic preparations, quote unquote, as you and me and the Prime Minister were all told we had in January by the Cabinet Office and by the current Cabinet Secretary Wormold, if that had been true, then there would definitely have been no need for a lockdown in the first lockdown either. Because everything which they thought about pandemic planning turned out to be complete and utter bullshit, and the system completely imploded, it's very hard for me to see how the first one could have been avoided. To think that could have been avoided, and I'll give you, I'll go forward in time in order to make my point. In autumn, you could see how the system collapsed. And when Boris was faced with the numbers on the NHS, he called another lockdown, right, in autumn 2020. The idea that in March 2020, there's a world in which he watched all the numbers going up on the NHS, which as it was in fact overwhelmed in various places, that all continued. The rest of Europe, having said we're not going to do lockdown, then all starting to do lockdowns like dominoes. And then Boris alone standing firm and saying, we're not doing that here. I think there's just no way there's no hypothetical world in which that would have happened. And you know it wouldn't have happened because he didn't even do it in September, October time. He imploded having watched the first one. So I also think that the first one was defensible in the sense of there was no system, there was no testing, there was no nothing. As you know, all of us in the centre of government suddenly had to confront the fact that all the officials who thought they had the world's best pandemic plan then suddenly kind of admitted to us it's all bollocks and there is no plan and we don't know what the hell we're going to do. There is nothing. We also didn't know how damaging it was for children then in January, February 2020. So I think some kind of emergency measure, short emergency measure, was reasonable in the circumstances of given complete state failure and complete state collapse, February, early March. I can't see what else reasonably, how else the system could have gone in a different way. Certainly not with that Prime Minister. You'd also have to hypothesise some completely different, if you had Lee Kuan Yew in charge, maybe something different could have happened, or Elon in charge.
Or Maddie.
No, God, no.
But
be doomed.
I can't see, but I think it is important to separate out that first initial crisis from what came later. After the first crisis, there is absolutely zero doubt in my mind that what should have happened is a whole bunch of things were done April through to August, September, and if those things had been done properly, then there was never any need for further lockdowns and all of the huge economic and other damage that did.
How did we go from that to what we saw later on in the pandemic, where we had this extremely complicated, often self-contradictory and ever-changing suite of rules that often seemed manifestly insane to anyone who analyses them? You know, the rules about when people could gather and how many, the rules about if you stand up in a pub, you're in violation of the rules, what is the proper diameter of a Scotch egg, and all that jazz. Like, how did we go to that?
Because the system's original plan was there's nothing that can be done, you just have to sit back and watch it and you can't do anything. Then the system panicked. Then there's the first lockdown. Then the system says, oh, actually, the public are supportive of various tough measures. But critically, Britain has become super centralised in almost every way. So if you compare what happened in Britain with some of the European countries and also with Asian countries, an extremely strong contrast is the extent to which everything was basically a bunch of people written around a cabinet table in London, which, in my opinion, is completely insane and is responsible for a lot of the insanity, versus what happens in other countries which have a much saner constitutional balance, much more decentralised, and therefore they could say to you decide that there, you decide that there. We're not writing down rules on how pubs work hundreds of miles away from us, right? That seems to many countries completely mad.
This is interesting because another theme of your writing is that it's simultaneously super centralised, but also that ministers have no real power. There's a Potemkin element to governance.
Correct.
Like, how do those two things function together? I mean, they don't, but do they contradict? Do those two premises kind of contradict?
No, they don't, because the power has vanished elsewhere. So it has super centralised, but the power has also gone away from ministers. Where's the power gone? Well, look to the Cabinet Office. The power of the Cabinet has shrunk, and the ministerial jobs have become largely Potemkin. But the power of the Cabinet Secretary is now extreme. Cabinet Secretary is much more powerful than any minister apart from the PM.
Yeah.
Now, if you go back and look at the beginning of the Cabinet Office, right? When the Cabinet Office was created in the crisis of the Somme and the disaster of 1917, it was agreed by everybody, OK, we're going to create this new thing to try and coordinate the centre of government better, but it must have absolutely no control over any personnel, and it must have absolutely no control over any policy of any kind. It is purely a secretarial function to coordinate papers being moved around Whitehall, right? Everyone agreed that. And everyone agreed if it did either of those two things, it would be an obvious constitutional abomination and a political disaster. What have we done? We now have a Cabinet Office which is completely in charge of all HR and personnel, and has its own policy functions, which are much more powerful and much more important than what the PM's office does. So that's the answer to your correct question. How come we've got a system which has become super centralised, but yet the ministers seem Potemkin? The answer is Sir Humphrey has taken the power, and that's where the power is. But the power is no longer accountable in Parliament. The power sits used secretly inside Cabinet Office.